Year 711. A date etched with fire and blood in the darkest pages of universal history. The Mediterranean Sea. The one that for centuries united the most colossal empires on earth. It was preparing to contemplate an abyss. A radical change, violent and irreversible. To the north, the Iberian Peninsula. The kingdom of the Visigoths, a land of stone churches and fertile fields. Rich on the outside, but eaten away on the inside. A kingdom rotten by ambition, betrayal, and the specter of civil war. To the south, the coasts of Africa, where the desert wind blew strongly. There, a young empire, vibrant and hungry for glory. He looked at the horizon with the eyes of a conqueror. No one in Europe could imagine the size of the disaster. No one heard the distant drums. Nobody suspected that the destiny of an entire continent was going to change in just a few months. This is not a simple chronicle of crowns and dates. This is the true history of Al-Andalus. 8 centuries of a brutal clash, where steel cut flesh. 8 centuries of a coexistence forged between the edge of the sword and the cold splendor of science. To understand how an entire kingdom fell apart in the blink of an eye, we must travel to the exact moment the storm crossed the water. The great Umayyad Caliphate already extended from the deserts of Arabia to the waves of the Atlantic. A perfect military machine, cold, relentless. The hooves of thousands of horses echoed in the sand. And its governor in North Africa, Musa ibn Nusayr. He sought to expand the borders of Islam towards the mysterious in Greenland, what many still called Hispania. The silence in the Visigoth palaces was tense. The Muslims did not cross the strait blindly, nor by surprise. They were invited. The nobility of Toledo itself, blinded by power, opened the doors of their house to them. The Visigoth king Witiza had died, and the throne of Toledo was occupied by Don Rodrigo, the last king of his line. But Witiza's children did not accept the new ruler. Hatred began to weave its web on the peninsula. In the border city of Ceuta, Count Don Julian breathed with rage. It is said that he hated King Rodrigo with all his soul. Seeking revenge and power, Julian secretly met with Muslim leaders. The night winds stirred the torches. He offered them ships, he gave them maps, and revealed to them the best-kept secret: the peninsula is unprotected, divided, and ready to fall. Musa ibn Nusayr saw the perfect opportunity, and he sent his best general, a man of legendary courage and iron determination, Tariq ibn Ziyad. April of the year 711. Hidden by the cover of night, a fleet of ships crossed the dangerous waters of the strait. 7,000 warriors, mostly Berbers from North Africa. They set foot on the soil of the Iberian Peninsula for the first time. They landed in the shadow of a gigantic floating rock. A place that from that very day would change its name forever. Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, the place that today the world knows as Gibraltar. Legend has it that, as soon as he stepped onto the sand, Tariq made a radical decision. He looked his men in the eyes, pointed to the merchant ships that had transported them, and gave the boldest order of his life. Burn the ships. The wood creaked violently, and the flames illuminated the night of the strait. The message to his army was clear and brutal. There is no turning back. There are no ships to return, no retreat possible. Either we win on this earth, or we will die on it. As the smoke from the ships cleared, King Rodrigo was far away, far away. He was fighting a rebellion by the Basques in the cold northern lands, in the rain and mud, When the news of the landing reached his ears, he didn't give it any importance. He thought it was a simple looting raid, pirates who would flee when they saw the steel. But he was completely wrong. It wasn't a looting, it was a full-blown invasion. Rodrigo mobilized his army in haste, crossing the peninsula from north to south. It was a forced march, suffering the suffocating heat of the Spanish summer. The dust of the road blinded the men. His soldiers arrived south exhausted, thirsty, and with low morale. Even so, the Visigoth army was immense, it almost doubled Tariq's forces in number. The final clash was inevitable. In mid-July of the year 711, on the banks of the Guadalete River, the wind stopped. A dead silence dominated the plains. Two worlds, two religions, and two ways of understanding war came face to face. Don Rodrigo's army shone. Their heavy armor reflected the relentless light of the sun. The royal standards of the Goths waved, superb, defiant. In front of them, the forces of Tariq. Light, fast, deadly. A compact block waiting in perfect formation, motionless. Fear hung in the air, sticky, real. Suddenly, thunder. The war drums sounded with a deafening rhythm. The ground shook under the horses' hooves. The air was filled with a unison scream, wild. The Visigoth cavalry charged, unleashing the storm. The Battle of Guadalete became hell. A blind whirlwind of dust, sweat, blood and metal. The clash of steel against steel resounded like 1,000 hammers. 4 days, the combat was brutal, merciless, without quarter. The rain of arrows darkened the sky, and the mud on the shore was dyed red. The Visigoths resisted fiercely, pushing for their numerical superiority. But at the most critical moment, when the forces were failing, the great curse of Spain made its appearance. The betrayal. Witiza's brothers, those nobles stabbed by ambition. They controlled the wings of King Rodrigo's army. And they fulfilled their secret pact with the invaders. In the midst of absolute chaos, they ordered their troops to turn around. They abandoned their king on the battlefield, and joined Tariq's forces. The flank of the royal army was completely exposed, naked. The Muslim light cavalry, fast as the desert wind, took advantage of the gap with surgical precision, and surrounded the troops loyal to the monarch. The Visigothic resistance crumbled, broken inside. Panic gripped the soldiers. A mass of humans fleeing desperately, while they were hunted one by one. Screams of agony drowned out by the mud of the river. King Rodrigo was never heard from again. On the muddy banks of the Guadalete River, among the fallen bodies, only his white horse was found, tired, injured. And his royal boots, woven with threads of gold and rhinestones, sunk in the mud. The last Visigoth king had disappeared, and with him, his entire kingdom. The defeat at Guadalete was not the end of a simple battle. It was the total, sudden, collapse of an entire state. Tariq, aware that the enemy was decapitated, did not waste a single second. He did not wait for reinforcements from Africa. He didn't stop to rest or celebrate. It advanced like lightning, relentless, towards the very heart of the peninsula. Spanish cities watched the storm with terror. Demoralized, deeply divided, and tired of Toledo's abusive government, they fell one after another, like dominoes before the Islamic advance. Many of them did not even draw steel. They opened their large wooden doors to the Muslims, in exchange for pacts that respected their lives, their lands, and their property. In less than 3 years, a handful of thousands of desert warriors managed to conquer the immensity of the Iberian Peninsula. From the burning beaches of the south to the frozen peaks of the Pyrenees. The Visigoth kingdom, that had ruled these lands for 300 years, had been erased from the face of the earth. An absolute collapse, a devastating strategic blow. Only a scar was left etched at the northern end. A narrow strip of steep mountains, dark caves and impenetrable forests. Asturias. The only corner that escaped the clutches of the new empire. There, between the fog and the living rock, a group of fugitives was hiding. Visigoth nobles wounded in their pride, hungry, covered in mud. Led by a man whose name would resonate throughout the centuries. Pelayo. They took refuge in the silence of the stones, holding their breath, waiting for their moment. For the Muslim generals, those men from the north were not a danger. They were just a bunch of ragged savages, hidden in the living rock. They were not worth the expense of an arrow, nor the effort of a battle. They ignored them. They thought that the conquest was total, that the land of Hispania belonged completely to them. What a big mistake! They didn't know that in the cold bowels of those mountains, in Covadonga, a silent spark was being born. An ember hidden under the ash. A spark that would take 800 long years to extinguish. The era of Al-Andalus was beginning. A new province incorporated into the gigantic Islamic Caliphate. A land that, by an astonishing twist of fate, would become the cultural beacon of the West. While the great capitals of Europe sank into the mud, illiteracy and the darkness of the Middle Ages, Al-Andalus was preparing to shine. The flag of Islam was already flying strongly on the battlements of Toledo and Córdoba. The fate of the peninsula was sealed by iron. The next 8 centuries would write an epic of absolute power, refined art, revolutionary science, and eternal war. A story recorded by 2 sides, that would change the course of the world forever. The clatter of swords died away. The dense smoke from the fires began to dissipate, and the dust of the plains settled back on the ground. Silence returned to the battlefields, giving way to a metamorphosis that Europe had never witnessed. The ancient Hispania of the Visigoths, rural, isolated and fragmented. It stopped being a peripheral province to become one of the richest and most advanced lands in the West. Decades later, after internal wars and bitter struggles for power, the independent emirate of Córdoba was officially born. A birth that occurred thanks to the arrival of a ghost. A man who escaped the clutches of death in the deserts of the East. Abderramán I, whom history would call the immigrant. The last survivor of the Umayyad dynasty after a bloody massacre in Damascus. Theirs were beheaded in a banquet of betrayal. He crossed North Africa in absolute isolation, pursued, dodging assassins in every shadow. Until he set foot on the soil of Al-Andalus in the year 755. His arrival changed the rules of the game forever. Abd al-Rahman did not come to loot the churches or burn the crops, he came to build his own empire. He unified rival tribes with diplomacy and cunning. He crushed internal rebellions with a ruthless iron hand, and definitively severed political ties with the distant Caliphate of Baghdad. Córdoba was chosen as the capital of this new state. A city that previously languished on the banks of the Guadalquivir River. In a few years it transformed into the most spectacular metropolis in the Western world. Power grew in the hands of his successors, especially with the rise of Abderramán III. Córdoba touched the sky in the year 929. The emir proclaimed himself caliph, the ultimate leader of the Muslims, king on earth and guide in spirit. The Caliphate of Córdoba was born, the absolute superpower of the 10th century. The contrast with the rest of the world was brutal. While Paris was just a small settlement of huts and muddy streets, and London suffered the terror and plunder of Viking harassment, Córdoba shone with its own light, literally. Much of Europe was trapped in the mud, misery and spiritual darkness. Córdoba, on the other hand, stood as one of the most advanced and illuminated cities on the continent. The hum of urban life could be breathed around every corner. Running water flowed directly into the citizens' homes, transported by a massive network of stone aqueducts. Hundreds of public baths where steam washed away tiredness. Vibrant markets that smelled of spices, silk and leather. And white marble palaces that defied the passage of time. The population of Córdoba exceeded hundreds of thousands of inhabitants according to estimates at the time. A monstrous number, unthinkable for any other European city in those dark times. Men, women, sages and merchants of all races and religions crowded its cobbled avenues. But the true symbol of this power was not a walled fortress, but a temple. The Great Mosque of Córdoba. An endless, mystical, forest of marble columns, jasper and granite. Stones joined by horseshoe arches painted in red and white that seemed to float in the air, defying gravity. Each caliph expanded the sacred edifice, inlaid with brilliant gold mosaics brought from Byzantium. A total work of art that proclaimed to the nations of the earth the inexhaustible wealth of Al-Andalus. A few kilometers from the capital, Abderramán III ordered a dream made into stone to be sculpted. Madinat al-Zahra, the shining city. A colossal palace complex, raised in terraces on the wild mountainside. Walls covered with fine ivory reliefs. Ponds and fountains of liquid mercury that sparkled and reflected the blinding light of the sun. And majestic halls, embellished with pure gold. There, the ambassadors of the Christian kings fell to their knees on the carpets, trembling with amazement before the imposing presence of the caliph. However, the most sacred treasure of Córdoba was not kept in the coffers of its palaces. It remained hidden in the silent shelves of their libraries. In a time when the kings of the north barely knew how to sign the scrolls with a cross, the Caliph Al-Hakam II assembled a mythical library with more than 400,000 volumes. A tireless army of copyists, translators and scholars worked day and night in the capital. The rustle of feathers and the smell of ink filled the rooms. Córdoba became the scientific beacon of humanity. The wise men of Al-Andalus rescued the lost texts of the Greek philosophers from oblivion. They saved the words of Aristotle and Plato from total disappearance, from the bonfire of time. They introduced to the European continent the numbers we use today, the Arabic system. They brought with them the most revolutionary concept of the human mind, the number zero. Mathematics advanced by leaps and bounds, with astonishing mathematical coldness. Algebra and trigonometry were perfected to measure kingdoms and build perfect walls. Córdoban astronomers observed the night sky with bronze astrolabes in their hands. They precisely calculated the silent journey of the planets and stars. They designed star maps that, centuries later, would be used by the great navigators of the ocean. In the plains and fields, applied science changed the skin of Spain forever. Muslim engineers domesticated water. They built gigantic wooden water wheels that groaned with the river, deep irrigation ditches and underground irrigation networks. Systems that transformed dry and cracked wastelands into orchards brimming with life. They introduced new crops, plants that today define the gastronomy and wealth of southern Europe. Rice, sugar cane, bitter oranges, lemon, cotton and eggplant. These products appeared for the first time in Spanish markets, changing the flavors, the trade, and the diet of the continent forever. Medicine in Al-Andalus was centuries ahead of its time. Legendary doctors like Abulcasis, the true father of modern surgery, sculpted steel surgical instruments and iron that survive in today's operating rooms. They performed cataract operations with a surgeon's pulse. They sewed the flesh open with silk threads. And they understood the value of extreme hygiene and isolation to contain pests. An abyss compared to the rest of Europe, where ailments were fought with prayers, fanaticism and superstition. Rhythm, poetry and fashion also dictated the trends of the continent. Figures like Ziryab, a revolutionary artist who came from the lands of Baghdad. He added the fifth string to the lute, the direct ancestor of the Spanish guitar. Ziryab taught the court of Córdoba the art of eating according to time, to replace metal with crystal glasses, and to change clothing according to the course of the seasons, dictating the first rules of etiquette on the continent. Throughout this golden century, three different faiths coexisted on the same soil. Muslims, Mozarabic Christians and Jews shared the same walls and traded in the squares. Jewish thinkers such as Maimonides, and Muslim philosophers such as Averroes, debated faith, science and reason in the courtyards of the capital. They built a definitive cultural bridge that awakened the intellect of a dormant Europe. Al-Andalus had ceased to be a simple war machine. It stood as the epicenter of knowledge, opulence and art of the known world. An empire that appeared to be eternal, impregnable, protected by colossal walls and thousands of spears. However, the peak of success is the prelude to the abyss. In the gloom of the palaces of Córdoba, where astronomy and thought were previously discussed, the ambition of men and military greed began to pull the strings of betrayal. The foundations of the great caliphate were secretly beginning to crack. The vices of opulence and internal fractures awoke with violence. And the Christian kingdoms of the north, weathered by 2 centuries of misery, cold and battles, they began to fix their gaze on the riches of the south. They looked with a voracious hunger. The splendor of the Caliphate of Córdoba was extinguished by the ambition of a single warrior. His name was Almanzor, the victorious one for Allah. At the end of the 10th century, this fearsome military leader snatched the reins of the state. He left the legitimate caliph locked in his rooms, converted into a simple palace ornament. Almanzor transformed Al-Andalus into a destructive war machine, perfect. He personally led more than 50 punitive campaigns against the Christian north. He looted the streets of Barcelona, he reduced the city of Coimbra to ashes. And he desecrated the great sanctuary of Santiago de Compostela. The chronicles tell of the great humiliation. He forced the Christian captives to carry the heavy bells of the temple on their shoulders, walking barefoot hundreds of kilometers to the naves of the Mosque of Córdoba. However, Almanzor's triumph paved the way for disaster. His tyranny was sustained only by fear and the gold he gave to his Berber horsemen. When Almanzor breathed his last in the year 1002, the power vacuum unleashed the storm. The Fitna. A ruthless, bloody, civil war that tore the bowels of Al-Andalus to pieces for 30 years. The brothers of faith cut their throats in the avenues for control of the walls. The spectacular palaces of Madinat al-Zahra suffered looting and torch fire, reduced to rubble and grey ash. In the year 1031, the Caliphate of Córdoba was dissolved forever. That block of indomitable granite fractured into more than 30 small sovereign kingdoms. The kingdoms of Taifas, Seville, Toledo, Zaragoza, Granada. Each capital declared itself master of its own destiny. Although these small courts competed arrogantly to possess the poets and the finest arts, on the battlefield they appeared fragile, unsupportive and blind with suspicion. Their mutual hatred was so deep that, all too often, they sent chests full of gold to the Christian monarchs of the north, begging that their horsemen would come down to exterminate the neighboring Muslim Taifas. This extreme weakness was the golden opportunity the north had been waiting for. The small Christian kingdoms, that had been resisting for 3 centuries between hunger and rocks, had become battle-hardened and united by powerful crowns. Castilla, Leon, Navarra and Aragon were no longer bands of refugees. They were professional armies. The great turning point came in the year 1885. King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile advanced with his troops and conquered the emblematic city of Toledo. The old Visigoth capital returned to Christian hands. The psychological impact shook the entire Islamic world. The Taifas, terrified to see that the Christians recovered the center of the peninsula. They made a desperate decision. They called on an outside power. The Almoravids crossed the strait, and later the Almohads. Rigorous and militarized empires from North Africa. These Berber warriors arrived with iron military discipline and relentless fanaticism. They stopped the Christian advance in bloody battles such as Sagrajas and Alarcos. And they unified Al-Andalus again through strict religious control. But their intolerance crushed the rich cultural coexistence of Córdoba and Seville, forcing thousands of Mozarabic Jews and Christians to flee to the northern kingdoms. Total war for the peninsula was declared. The Pope proclaimed the campaign in Spain a holy crusade, drawing Knights Templar and warriors from all over Europe to fight Islam. The definitive shock that changed the destiny of the peninsula occurred in the year 1212. Las Navas de Tolosa. In the fields of Jaén, a great Christian army led by King Alfonso VIII of Castile faced the immense hosts of the Almohad Caliph. The previous silence in the valley was deafening. The battle was a monumental carnage, a massive clash of steel, spears and cavalry. The scraping of swords cut the air, and the dust blinded the combatants in absolute chaos. Christian strategy and courage broke the caliph's defensive lines, provoking the disastrous retreat of the Muslim army. Las Navas de Tolosa broke the backbone of Islamic power in Spain. The Almohad Empire completely collapsed. The largest Muslim cities in the south fell one after another, like dominoes. Córdoba, the great jewel of the Caliphate, was reconquered in 1236. Seville, the metropolis of the Guadalquivir, fell in 1248. The Christian advance seemed unstoppable. The territory of Al-Andalus, which once occupied almost the entire peninsula, was reduced to a small strip of mountainous land in the south. The last bastion of Islam in Europe. The map of the peninsula had become almost completely Christian. But in the shadows of the Sierra Nevada mountains, Islam resisted. The Nasrid Kingdom of Granada was born, the last breath of Al-Andalus. For over 250 long years, this small kingdom achieved the impossible. He survived surrounded by enemies, thanks to a brilliant and desperate strategy. Pay huge amounts of gold to the kings of Castile, and play diplomacy. Granada became an oasis of wealth, art and melancholy. It was in this era of isolation that the pinnacle of Islamic beauty was built. The Alhambra. A dream palace, where water flowed through marble patios and the walls whispered poetry. The stones spoke, as if they knew their time was running out. But in the year 1482, destiny knocked on the door of Granada. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, united their crowns. And they swore not to rest until the flag of the cross flew atop the Alhambra. The Granada War began, a relentless military campaign that would last 10 years. Castilla did not attack out of desperation. He used a strategy of absolute attrition. They burned the crop fields, they blocked the ports so that help from Africa would not arrive. And they conquered the surrounding cities one by one, like Malaga and Baza. And to make matters worse, the curse of Al-Andalus struck again from within. betrayal and family civil war destroyed the Nasrid palace. The young Boabdil, known as the Boy, rebelled against his own father for the throne. He divided the defenders of Granada just as the enemy was at the gates. By the year 1491, the city of Granada was completely alone, surrounded by an army of more than 50,000 Christian soldiers. The Catholic monarchs built a stone fortress in front of their walls, the city of Santa Fe. A clear strategy to show the Muslims that they would not leave there until the city fell. Winter came cruelly, hunger was pressing, and desperation flooded the Moorish streets. On January 2, 1492, history changed course forever. Boabdil, with tears in his eyes and a broken heart, crossed the monumental gates of the city. He approached King Ferdinand and gave him the keys to the Alhambra, the last Muslim bastion. 8 centuries of Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula were fading on that cold winter morning. Legend has it that, as Boabdil rode away into exile, he stopped on a hill to look at Granada for the last time. He burst into tears bitterly at the loss of his paradise. And his own mother, the implacable Queen Aixa, threw him a phrase that was recorded in eternity. "Cry as a woman for what you did not know how to defend as a man." That place today is known as the Suspiro del Moro. Let us now look at the great board of history, 800 years condensed into a vital strategy. Why did the Muslims fall if they had the most advanced empire in the world? The answer lies not in the courage of their warriors, but in their own divisions. Each time Al-Andalus was united by a single leader, like Abderramán III or Almanzor. It was an unbeatable superpower that dominated Europe with science, wealth and steel. But every time they allowed ambition, selfishness and civil wars to divide them. Christian kingdoms, united by a single faith and a single goal, gained ground. The impact of these 8 centuries transformed the DNA of Spain forever. It wasn't just a military occupation, it was a deep and eternal cultural fusion. More than 4,000 words of our current language come directly from Arabic. The architecture, the music, the cuisine and the irrigation systems that we use today were born there. Al-Andalus was the bridge of light that saved the knowledge of antiquity. A legacy that prepared Spain to become, just a few months later, the greatest power on the planet. The history of 8 centuries has ended, but its echo will continue to resonate forever.